The Velthari delegation arrived in a cloud of their own light. Yusuf had read the briefings. He had studied the chromatophore displays, watched the archived footage of their first conclave contact 17 years ago, memorized the 43 known gestures that could be read as offensive. He had done all of this, and still was not prepared for what it felt like to stand in the receiving chamber of Meld Cradle Station, while 12 Velthari flowed through the entry port like a single organism made of shifting color. They were not the same size. The smallest was roughly the diameter of a dinner table. The largest, the one that moved at the center of the group, with a stillness that was itself a kind of motion, could have draped herself over a shuttle's nose cone. Their mantles caught the station's regulated light and returned it transformed blues and golds cycling in sequences that the translator pressed against Yusuf's ear, rendered as something like formal greeting, though the rendering felt like describing a symphony as a series of notes. Yusuf stood with the other conclave observers in the marked zone along the chamber's curved wall. Beside him, the Ythrani delegate, a being of gas and silicate membranes who communicated through precisely modulated pressure waves, made a sound that his translator rendered as procedural concern. Across the chamber, the Velthari's own translator, a small crustacean-like device mounted in the Queen's forward mantle that converted her displays into acoustic language for the non-chromatic species present. The protocol had been explained 4 times in the pre-summit briefing. Never approach the Queen's dais. Never speak before being chromatically addressed. Never expose the teeth. Yusuf was not thinking about his teeth when the Queen's youngest daughter identified in the briefing materials as a princess, though the Velthari word apparently meant something closer to emerging cognition node, turned her forward-facing chromatophores toward him and pulsed a soft, inquiring yellow. He smiled. It was reflexive and immediate, and he understood he had made an error approximately 1/4 of a second after the smile was already happening. The chamber shifted. Not loudly, the Velthari did not do loud, exactly, but every chromatophore display in the room recalibrated. A ripple of rust orange moved through the delegation, like a word passed in a crowd. The Queen's primary sensory delegate, the briefing called her Queen's Sight, a role that combined the functions of advisor, sensory recorder, and what Yusuf's notes somewhat inadequately called the Queen's most trusted eyes, turned toward him. She was mid-sized among the delegation, her mantle running a complex pattern of gray-green that his translator offered as observational mode. The junior diplomat beside Yusuf, a human attaché named Pereira, exhaled very quietly through his nose. Yusuf did what came naturally to him after 15 years of field work in environments where he was the only member of his species. He stopped moving entirely and waited. After 11 seconds he counted, he pressed his palms flat against his thighs, turned slightly toward the nearest Velthari protocol officer, and said carefully, "I've caused an incident with a facial expression. I'd like to acknowledge the discomfort I caused and ask what I should do to address it." The protocol officer translated this. The rust orange in the room did not deepen. Queen's Sight pulsed something that his translator, after a pause, rendered as acknowledged and filed. It was not forgiveness, exactly. But the temperature in the room, metaphorically speaking, did not worsen. What Queen's Sight did not relay to the translator, because it was an internal notation rather than a communicative display, was the pattern that she held in the private chromatophores of her inner mantle, the ones that only the Queen herself could read at full resolution. The human showed distress at causing discomfort to a stranger, an involuntary distress. His body registered it before his cognition could manage it. She added it to her record. It did not fit any category she had for alien behavior. The summit resumed its procedural rhythm. Yusuf moved carefully, breathed through his nose, kept his lips together when his face wanted to do human things. He was cataloging everything the way the Velthari delegates oriented around the Queen, not through facing her but through the angle of their rearward chromatophore panels, the way the youngest, the princess, kept drifting toward the outer edges of the group's formation, the way her inquiring yellow kept returning to the human side of the chamber. She was curious. He recognized it because curiosity, it turned out, looked like curiosity in most species that had evolved it. A tilting toward, a not quite stillness. The summit broke for the first recess cycle. The Velthari delegation moved toward their prepared habitat, a section of Meld Cradle that had been flooded with the ammonia salt atmosphere they required, and the human observers filed toward their own quarters. Yusef was nearly to the corridor when something touched his right hand. He looked down. The princess had followed the group to the boundary line and extended a single tentacle tip across it, touching the back of his hand with a lightness that barely registered as pressure. She was displaying a color he hadn't seen in any of the briefing materials. A very pale, very clear violet. Cycling slowly. His translator offered nothing. Either it wasn't a known communicative display, or it was communicative in a way that didn't have a linguistic analog. He didn't flinch. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He stood, and she held the contact for approximately 3 seconds, and then withdrew. He would think about the violet color for a long time afterward. The structural alarm that sounded 6 minutes into the recess cycle was a single sustained tone, low enough to feel in the chest. Yusef had been rereading his briefing notes when he heard it, and he was already at his cabin door when the station's system voice specified pressure, irregularity, lower ring, sections 11 through 14, non-critical advisory. Personnel advised to remain in current location, pending assessment. He looked at Pereira across the corridor. Non-critical, Pereira said. They said non-critical about the Kareth station's cooling system 40 seconds before it cascaded, Yusef said, and went to find someone who knew where the lower ring was. The lower ring was not supposed to be accessible during the summit. The station's architecture was layered. The main diplomatic chambers and habitat sections occupied the central torus, while the lower ring was infrastructure, life support redundancies, pressure management systems, the original construction scaffolding that had been partially repurposed into service corridors. The door sealing it from the main torus was unlocked. This would later be identified as a maintenance oversight. Someone had failed to re-engage the lock after a pre-summit inspection. The princess had found it interesting. This, too, would later make sense when xenobiologists cross-referenced her behavioral profile with Velthari developmental data. Young Velthari, in the emerging cognition node phase, were driven by precisely the kind of aimless environmental exploration that the summit protocols had not accounted for. She had followed the scent of the service corridor, something chemical in the recycled air, a compound her chemoreceptors associated with novel environments, and 2 of her attendants had followed her because they were biologically incapable of allowing her to move alone. Yusef found all of this out later. What he knew in the moment was, the station system had updated the advisory to elevated concern, while he was still arguing with the duty officer about access. The lower ring's pressure differential had climbed from 0.3 to 0.7 in 11 minutes, and the princess was not with the delegation. Queen's Sight had noticed this at the same moment. The delegation was in collective distress, a rippling amber that moved through every Velthari present in waves, because through their fractional shared consciousness, they could perceive the princess's absence like a gap in a sentence. What they could not do was act. The decision to send individuals into a structurally compromised zone required the Queen's direct chemical authorization. And the Queen was in her habitat enclosure, and getting a chemical signal through the habitat wall to the action authorization glands of her delegates would take Queen's Sight, had calculated it approximately 9 minutes. The station's updated advisory suggested they had 6. She was watching the human observers for the same reason she was always watching them. Record keeping. She had not predicted what she saw. Yusef asked the duty officer once, 1 question, 1 answer, and then he was moving. She recorded him moving. She recorded the quality of it. Not hesitation. Not bravado. not the chemical surge aggression that she had seen in other species' crisis responses. He moved the way something moves when it has already made the decision, and the body is simply following. His face was doing something she could not read, not quite the teeth showing, not quite the distress expression she had catalogued earlier, something between the two. The lower ring corridor smelled of ammonia and ozone, and the particular metallic sharpness of compromised sealant. Yusef had grabbed a maintenance kit from the wall mount outside the duty station. He wasn't sure exactly what was in it, but he had been in enough field situations to know that having a kit was better than not having one. The corridor lights were on emergency amber. The floor was vibrating at a frequency he felt in his molars. He found them in Section 12. The princess and her 2 attendants had clustered against the interior wall, which was, at least, the correct instinct. The breach was in the exterior hull, a micrometeorite strike no larger than his fist that had compromised the outer layer and started a slow decompression through a crack running along a pressure seam. The seam ran toward the bulkhead door at the far end of the corridor. He could see, in the emergency lighting, the way the air currents in the corridor were bending slight, but visible if you knew how to look. The way they had bent in the Marek facility before the east wall gave way. He had 17 minutes of experience watching air currents bend before a wall gave way. It was enough. He did not try to communicate with the princess. There wasn't time, and he had no mechanism. He opened the maintenance kit, found the emergency sealant foam industrial adhesive pressurized in a canister, designed for exactly this kind of micro-breach, and moved toward the crack, which meant moving toward the compromise section, which meant moving away from the bulkhead door. He sprayed the crack. It would buy time, not solve the problem. The seam was too long for the canister's capacity, and he could see from the pressure gauge on the corridor wall that the differential had climbed again. He got back to the princess and her attendants and pointed, clearly, at the bulkhead door. The attendants responded to directed motion. Or perhaps to the princess responding to directed motion. They began to move. The corridor shuddered. The crack was holding, but the seam adjacent to it was not. The bulkhead door was 30 meters away. He could calculate, in the loose, approximate way of someone who had survived 3 field emergencies by counting seconds and estimating margins, that they had enough time for the princess and 1 attendant to clear the door if he moved them now. He grabbed the maintenance kit's pressure wrench, jammed it into the door's manual override slot, started cranking. The door groaned open. The princess flowed through, her chromatophores cycling white. He had no translation for this and no time to want one. The first attendant followed. The second attendant was moving. Would make it, probably, if the seam held for another 10 seconds. The seam did not hold for another 10 seconds. The corridor pressure spiked and equalized with a sound like the station coughing. The door began to cycle shut automatically, pressure event response. The system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Yusef put his shoulders against the door. The metal was cold through his jacket. Cold enough to feel it as a specific kind of cold. The kind that doesn't burn all at once, but compounds, settling in through layers. He held the door and the second attendant passed through, and he felt the automatic mechanism working against him, and then he stepped through and let it close, and stood in the main corridor with his hands very carefully not touching anything because both palms were blistering. He looked at them for a moment. The pattern of the cold was already reading on his skin. Queen's sight was present. She had followed when the duty officer finally moved. She had arrived in time to see the door. She had seen his face while he held it. She could not process it. She ran the data through every category she had for interspecies behavior and found nothing that fit. There was no chemical signal from the princess compelling him. He had no receptor for such signals. There was no reproductive logic. There was no kin. Imperative. He had moved toward a breach and held a door shut with his body and sustained injury to ensure the passage of organisms he had met 90 minutes ago. She had no word for what he had done. The Velthari had many words for sacrifice: sacrifice for colony, sacrifice for queen, sacrifice for propagation, but all of them required a biological mechanism. All of them required a signal that said, This cost is worth this continuation. He had acted in the absence of any such signal. He had computed worth on his own. She was still trying to build the category when the princess did something unprecedented. The princess had turned to face Yusef, and she was displaying a color that Queen Sight had seen only once before, during the bonding ceremony of the previous queen. A deep, luminous amber with white at its center, cycling in the specific rhythm that in Velthari physiology was not learned, but generated an autonomic display, emerging from structures below conscious control, activated by the recognition of something the organism's nervous system categorized as that which the colony is built around. The princess was displaying it at a human with blistered hands, who was very carefully keeping his face still. Queen Sight added the notation to her record and began composing, in the private language of her inner mantle, a message for the queen. She transmitted it in real time, through the fractional shared consciousness, into the queen's direct perception. The queen's response was immediate. It moved through every Velthari on the station simultaneously, the way a wave moves through water, not spreading, but arriving, everywhere, at once. Queen Sight felt it in the chromatophores she didn't consciously control. The deep ones, the ones she hadn't activated in years. She knew what was coming. The queen spoke with her whole body. Yusef was in the medical station adjacent to the duty office, sitting on a surface that was not quite the right height for human anatomy, while a med system wrapped both his hands in hydrogel dressing. He was looking at the dressing and trying to decide if the burning sensation was diminishing or if he was simply growing accustomed to it, when Pereira appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested something had happened that was not in any briefing. "The Queen," Pereira said, "is requesting your presence." The word the translator used was requesting. I want to flag that the Velthari apparently do not have a grammatical structure that exactly corresponds to request. The translator thinks it might be closer to summoning, but has noted that summoning implies an authority relationship that may not accurately characterize the Queen's intention, and the translator seems, Pereira stopped, genuinely uncertain. "I'll come," Yusef said. The diplomatic chamber was full. Every conclave delegation present on Meld Cradle had apparently been notified. 2-3. Buddy well. Yusef walked into a room containing representatives of 11 species and felt the particular quality of attention that a room produces when every organism in it is watching the same point. He understood, now that point. The Queen had left her dais. This was not in any briefing material. The dais was not merely a physical position, it was, apparently, a communicative one, indicating the Queen's role in relation to others. The Queen, standing in the open floor of the chamber, in the center of the room, was the Velthari equivalent of something Yusef didn't have the context to fully name, but his body recognized it as significant in the same animal way it recognized a change in air pressure before a storm. She was enormous up close. Her mantle spanned a width that would have required him to outstretch both arms, and she was running a display that his translator could not keep pace with. It was cycling too fast, too many layers, too much simultaneous content. The translator's earpiece offered him fragments. The colony recognition pattern, the deep historical signal that the Velthari used to mark events into collective memory, the specific frequency that corresponded to what his briefing materials had called the bonding claim, that which the colony is built around. Direction of this one. The chamber was silent, in the way that a chamber becomes silent when something is happening that everyone present recognizes as exceeding their categories. Yusef stood. His hands were wrapped in white dressing. He kept them at his sides. The translator device in the Queen's forward mantle processed for a long moment. Then, you moved toward death for something that was not yours to protect. A pause, during which the Queen's chromatophores cycled through a sequence that even incomplete translation rendered as something like searching for words that may not exist in your language. In our biology, this is another pause. The concept does not translate. There is no chemical signal that would have compelled this. We have looked for the mechanism and found only the behavior. We do not know what to do with a species for whom sacrifice is instinct. The other delegations were very still. Yusef looked at the queen for a moment. He thought about the maintenance kit. He thought about the cold of the door against his shoulders. He thought about the princess's pale violet color that the translator had given him nothing for. He said, "I think it might not be instinct. I think we just practice it until we don't notice the decision anymore." The translator worked on this. The queen's display shifted. Then she did the thing that Queen's sight had already understood she would do. Because the queen had been receiving her sensory feed in real time from the moment the alarm sounded, and the queen had seen everything Queen's sight had seen, had felt the pattern assembling in the same way Queen's sight had felt it, had arrived at the same notation that had no existing category. The queen extended the leading edge of her mantle. The bioluminescent organ there, called the claim light in the briefing materials, present in all Velthari, but activated, in a queen, only during the formal bonding ceremonies that bound new organisms to the colony's memory, was glowing. She placed it against Yusef's bandaged hands. The light was warm. That was the fact his nervous system returned to him. The light was warm, in a way that seemed to have specific temperature rather than just radiance, specific contact rather than just illumination. He was aware of the chamber, of every set of eyes and sensory organs oriented toward the same space, of 11 species recalibrating something in their models. The Queen's translator device said, "Witness." And then again, more specifically, in what his earpiece flagged as a second language layer, "Remember." This was directed at every delegate in the room. It was, Yusef would learn later, the Velthari equivalent of a public record. Not a speech for the present, but a notation for the collective consciousness, transmitted through the fractional shared network to every Velthari alive. 3 billion organisms would receive this memory. They would add it to their record under a category that, as of approximately this moment, had only one entry. Queen's sight stood at the edge of the chamber and held the moment in the observational mode that was her function. She was still building the category. She had started with sacrifice without mechanism. She had moved to sacrifice without signal. She was beginning to think that both of those framings were wrong, that they assumed the absence of a mechanism was the point, when perhaps the point was that the human had a mechanism she couldn't detect. Not chemical, not kin-mapped, something else, something that operated on inputs she had no sensors for. She would spend the next 11 years of her career on this question. She would publish 4 papers that other xenobiologists would find extraordinary and inconclusive. She would return to Meldcradle twice for follow-up contact, and each time would add to her record, building the category incrementally. The way understanding builds when the subject resists easy classification. The warm light moved across Yusef's hands. He was looking down at the way the bioluminescence moved in patterns against the white dressing, and he was thinking because he was, professionally and constitutionally, a person who thought in biological terms about what it meant that warmth was warmth in so many different bodies. That contact communicated something prior to language. That the distance between kinds of minds might be real, and might be large, and might still admit, in specific moments, of bridging. The princess was at the queen's side. She was displaying the deep amber with white at the center, the one that Queen's sight had only seen once before. It was steady now. Not cycling, a held note. Yusef looked at her and carefully, deliberately, with full knowledge of what his face was doing, smiled. Not with teeth. Just with his eyes, the way humans do when they mean something. The princess pulsed once. Quick. In a color that his translator offered nothing for. He thought he was probably going to spend a long time learning what that color meant. The queen's light lay warm and specific against his bandaged hands, and somewhere in the station's lower ring, a repair crew was sealing a seam that had already changed more than it was rated for. And the chamber held its silence the way a held breath holds waiting to become something else, already in the process of becoming.